Welcome. Hello, I'm Will Hall. I'm a curriculum lead at Sentry, and I am very excited to be leading today's discussion on how schools are planning to spend catch-up funding. Some of the topics we'll be exploring today include digital solutions versus human resources, remote learning provisions, health and well-being, and of course, that all-important word, impact. We are very lucky to be joined by Matt Worski, Assistant Head at Reddish Vale High School in Stockport, Scott Nevitt, Assistant Head at Southfield School for Girls in Kettering, and Mark Anderson. Mark is a former school leader and the man behind the hugely popular @ICT Evangelist Twitter account. Mark's ICT Evangelist blog has won numerous awards, including the UK Education Blog of the Year award, and his passion for EdTech has led him to where he now works with schools, supporting them with teaching, learning, and EdTech, and speaks at events around the world on the topic. So we are very much in safe hands today. Welcome to you all. And I guess, the first question to start us off with would be, in a nutshell, what does catch-up mean to you? And if you don't mind, Matt, we'll start with you, please.
Oh, yeah. Well, what it means to me, obviously, during the post-pandemic world, we have to be looking at what students know and what they don't know, and ensuring that there's stuff in place to address their needs. I think being positive about it as well is really, really important, that pupils don't feel that they're being punished for what they've missed out on over a number of months. Catch-ups both online and it's in person as well. And I think it really has to complement what's going on in the class. So it's understanding that when we're doing catch-up sessions, whether that's with a tutor or whether it's through an online package, that it really links to what's going on in the curriculum at that time.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point you said about you can't let the children think it's their fault. That, the word catch-up could be quite misleading there, right? Because they lost learning, essentially, and it wasn't anything down to them. Scott, same question for you, really. What does catch-up funding mean to you and your students and staff?
I guess it's very, very similar. For us, it's about being optimistic about what we can do for our students, rather than sort of making them feel like there's something they've done wrong or it's a negative. A lot of language around catch-up has been negative in the press and other places. So it's trying to make our students believe that we're moving forward together as a collective. There's a lot of synergy going on across the school, but also it's about balance, about sort of the academic, what students can know and what they can do in the curriculum, but with that sort of social, emotional well-being side of it, sort of the reconnection to the community. And our students are individuals, obviously, and every student is different, and we have to kind of approach that and build that resilience back up for learning. And it's about formative, diagnostic, like Matt was saying, and it's about what they know, what they don't know, and being responsive more than ever before to our students. That's how we see it anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've both hit that nail on the head about removing the negativity from it. That you want to support your learners and to help them succeed. And Mark, this is a good opportunity now for you to give your take on it, not being in school, but your expertise in the education world.
Yeah, thank you very much, Will. Yeah, catch up. I mean, it's a really difficult phrase to get your head around because it does imply, like you said, that there's negativity in there. I think the key, really, like both Scott and Matt have alluded to, is that it's not the fault of the students, it's not the fault of the pupils, the learners in the school. It's just a really difficult offset from the situation we find ourselves in. And so with that idea of it being a deficit, it's then thinking about, like Matt has said, well, what is the deficit? How much has been lost? Where are those gaps in their learning? And then when it comes to thinking about the funding, which I know we'll get on to later on, it's about how you can then best support that. There's a bunch of schemes being provided by the government to help around all of this. Now, and then we'll dig into that stuff later as well. But I think the real key is to make sure that however you approach these things, it's done in a way which doesn't penalise students. It shouldn't be extra sessions after school, perhaps, or be seeing some sort of some sort of detention or situation like that. It should be sort of built in and interwoven. And again, we'll talk about this, I'm sure, but the importance of the relationships you have with your parents and your whole sort of school community around how you wrap that care around your learners to provide them with those opportunities so they can feel safe in moving forward in this is absolutely key, I feel. But yeah, just really reinforce what Scott and Matt have said. It's a really difficult situation we find ourselves in, isn't it? So What we are relatively fortunate in is that there is some extra funding available to try and support all of this. The difficulty is obviously for schools is to then best know how to actually go about plugging those gaps when they find them, and the best way forward with all of that.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. I think, yeah, it's really interesting that discussion. What's come out of that is just to ensure really that that the students don't feel this is their fault, and that they're being punished really. And you're absolutely right. Just suddenly keeping students back for hours after school is not really the way forward here if you want to get them on your side. Well, let's drill a bit more into the funds then themselves. And Scott, the next question is, to what extent will you be spending your funding on digital solutions versus human resources? We kind of touched on both those already, but kind of drilling into your plan and your school.
Yeah, I'll give you an ish answer. I'm not giving an exact answer. I'd probably say it's fairly balanced. It's sort of even-ish. But obviously there's other funding that comes into places that ties into it. So in terms of sort of the digital side of it, sort of platforms, devices, there's definitely some funding that can help there, with regards to things like Sentry, but also our use of things like tablets that we've rolled out to help with platforms like that in school, so we can embed the use of digital strategy platforms in the classroom with actual teachers, so when students are at home, they're much more independent. Things like buying visualizers for staff, if we're going to be sort of formative, diagnostic, and be responsive. We felt that was something we wanted to invest further in. We'd already bought some. We've tried to invest in more of those, so physical devices as well as digital platforms. But then obviously with staffing, whether that's one-to-one small groups, whether that's bringing in staff for extra cleaning, because then you can actually use the rooms that you want them to be in to do the things that you want digitally. So it's a messy answer, I guess, but it is. I think there's a lot of use for the funding that I think schools will put in place that will end up now allowing them to be able to use their digital strategy approaches that people wouldn't think are to do with catch up. I think like cleaning and things like that as well.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating, isn't it? That obviously you're saying all of these great things, looking at visualizers and tech and getting extra staff to help, but you're so right about you have to be able to clean this stuff. You have to clean the school. These are such a new world that we find ourselves in. Matt, same question to you, really. The split between digital and human.
Yeah. So first of all, it's just trying to work out what works. So looking at which platforms that are out there that are proven and that will move learning forward. And a lot of the research at the moment points towards embedding low stakes tests into the classroom and into homeworks, so that you can kind of get a glimpse of whether things are working, whether the content that the child is learning, that they know it or not. And low stakes testing is a really good way of doing that. So we've done quite a bit of looking at finding different platforms. We invested in Sentry, we invested in Language Note and a couple of other ones as well, just so we can, that really helps then the teachers kind of complement what goes on in the classroom. Along with that, we've been doing some tuition as well. So we've got a tutor that comes into school, and where possible, we've merged the two, so that they may go and deliver a session on a particular element, and then go away and do some sort of low stake testing on that on the online platform, and then that tells whether we've got it, and then that sort of then informs the next session. So kind of both are important, but yeah, it's picking the right one that you can sort of monitor and assess whether it's working. So.
Thank you, Matt. And Mark, I don't know if you have anything. I know obviously your situation is different. Your specialism is to advise schools, but just listening to what Scott and Matt have said, if you have any thoughts of your own on what's been discussed there.
The only thing I can add really, and it's highlighted by the responses from Scott and Matt really, is that it's all contextual. And so, what will work in Scott's school might not necessarily work in Matt's school, and vice versa. And it was really interesting that Scott mentioned the term sort of digital strategy, because that's something I spend a lot of time working with schools on, because it's really important to really map out, what you'll be doing with your technology in your school. Some schools, have had a really strong digital strategy in place for a long time. And, I remember talking with a previous guest on your webinar, Nick Ford, and they spent a long time working on a digital strategy. They're really well placed. And when the pandemic came along, it wasn't really a big jump for them to have to move across and start teaching remotely, because they had a lot of plans in place already. They had a whole variety of different, his school, a wide variety of different potential solutions they could use and avenues to explore. But if you're not in that context where you don't have a digital strategy in place, many schools really scrabbled at the beginning of lockdown and really struggled to actually get these things in place. So that's the sort of thing that I would unpick really, is that it's really important to have a digital strategy so that you can map out and plan for all the things that you need to include and make sure you can support your learners around this holiday of catch up. It's interesting that Scott mentioned the thing about cleaning. That has to form part of what you're doing, particularly if you've got shared devices. And whilst it's a weird thing to have to spend your money on when you're thinking about catch up or digital strategy, it absolutely has to be part of it, because it's incumbent upon us to make sure that our children are kept safe and healthy, as well as our colleagues in all of our schools as well. So that's the thing that I'd add to what Scott and Matt have already said, really, because it's so important that you actually know where you're going and the direction you're going and what you're trying to achieve. Just sort of like, and then do it. That really cut it. So you need to involve all your key stakeholders, which will be your teaching staff, obviously, your students, your parent community, your leadership team, the school finance team. All these people need to be involved in this process to try and work out the best way forward within your context. And you'll only know your context by engaging with all those key stakeholders to help inform what you want to do with your strategy.
Excellent, thank you, Mark. Well, something obviously we've all touched on, remote learning. Ask someone what that meant a year ago, we'd have got some very strange answers, I think, but it's pretty much driven education for the last 6-7 months. And the next question then is about that, and how does your catch-up funding tie into your remote learning strategy, and also to consider to what extent are these short-term measures to deal with the pandemic versus long-term investments? And Matt, would you mind kicking us off with that one?
Yeah, certainly. Of course. I mean, it does tie in massively with the remote learning strategy. We've been fortunate in that we've got a really forward-thinking IT technician who's built a lot of the infrastructure and had a lot of the things like Mark was alluding to. He had them already, a lot of them in place. We had a choice of whether we were going to go 365 in Teams or whether we were going to go, Google Classroom. So it was really, we had a good starting point. Where we've taken it then afterwards is we've looked in at sort of short-term investment, looking at hardware that students need to be able to access our e-learning platform. So investing in laptops, tablets, whatever it might be. And we realized that that's only got a short-term sort of life, really. So longer term, we've been building the likes of Google Classroom, making sure that everybody's trained appropriately. Making sure that the online offer links to the curriculum, linking in those low stakes tests, like I said, to the different parts of the curriculum. And then, I think training has been really important. Training staff, parents have been massive. Spend a lot of time in terms of that, offering one-to-one sessions, offering online Facebook Q&As, and various things like that. So it's been, there's a lot of immediate things that needed to happen, but then longer term, there's been, we're building something that we know is going to be probably with us for a long time. So it's investing in that infrastructure, like Mark was saying beforehand, has been pivotal, and luckily we had a lot of that in place. So that's helped massively.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. I think a key word there for everyone, I think, was training. That you can have these fantastic plans, which you clearly do, but if your staff and you're right, guardians and parents, if they're not on board, if they don't understand these new processes, these new solutions, it's not gonna have any impact. Scott, same question to you then about.
Yeah, to be honest, it is very, very similar. And the word luck there, no, it's not. We weren't lucky. There was some luck involved. I think there were lots of roads that came together for us, where staff had started to investigate online platforms, which ones they were preferring, and so, that kind of thing was going on. We had a strategy in terms of devices and things started to sort of develop not well before, but before, the end of March. So we were fortunate. Then, we decided to go ahead with 365 and go with Teams. And then in the short term, that has meant, staff training, student training, parent training, that kind of thing. Most of our staff had never heard of a Loom video before lockdown, and the hours I spent helping staff kind of develop their sort of Teams knowledge and the use of it was worth the investment, because it's made a big difference. and our staff have been excellent with moving from the classroom to online, but there's still so much to learn. So the staff training is really, really important. We're fortunate that we have 2 hours every Wednesday. Our school stops at 2:15 for students, and staff have 2 hours of CPD, professional learning time. And digital strategy is built into that regularly. We've had 3 sessions this term already, just gone. So that was done in the short term, but it is still part of our long term. So in terms of staff training and that kind of thing, that's definitely short term stuff had to happen, but it's now carried on through our development plan with staff training. And thing in the short term, it's devices that there is you are putting money into something perhaps isn't the best investment. It's what you can get hold of sometimes, or whatever it might be. Did I actually want to get those exact tablets? Well, possibly not. But at the time, so short-term investment isn't always the best. But now we're really getting stuff into the hands of students and staff in the classroom for things like low-stakes assessments using Sentry, things like that, working out which subjects prefer which devices, and then building that into our strategy. So it's like we don't just say everybody's having the same. So English might have a certain set of devices that work best for them, for the platforms they use, and then maths might only have tablets because they only use platforms that are okay with tablets, whereas history might decide they need to use keyboards more often. So there's lots of sort of longer term thinking going on, rather than just throwing the money at the devices, which at the beginning that's what you need to do to get them in the hands of people.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely spot on, Scott, there with talking to your subjects, your HODs, to look at what devices are suitable. Just one device does not fit all. I think it's quite clear from what you're saying. And Mark, this is very much your world that we're talking about here. This is what you do. And so I guess the question for you, Mark, is what would your advice be to schools that are in the process of creating a digital strategy or don't have one? I mean, we've heard from Mark and Scott, and they were very much in the process. They essentially had these strategies and they really helped them. But what's your advice for schools that are starting?
Yeah, and it's really, really difficult for those schools that weren't really as far down the path as Scott and Matt were at the beginning of lockdown. It's been very, very difficult for schools. But something that I worked on with a friend of mine who's managing director of another edtech company, Al Kingsley, we wrote a guide to creating a digital strategy for schools. So lots of schools, that's available for free. You can download that from schooldigitalstrategy.com. And the thing I would say to everybody really is whether you've got one in place or not, it should be seen as an iterative process anyway. So if you have already got a digital strategy in your school, it is a cyclical process and one that needs to be revisited regularly and be thought of and be intertwined into everything that you do, because it's not about the technology. We were talking in the last question about money spends and remote learning strategies and all these sort of things, but the key that can really make or break all of this isn't the technology normally. It's actually the people, the investments in time and training, in supporting them. And it's not just the teachers. It's about as educators, we know if under normal circumstances we want to get good outcomes in our classroom, then that's about managing the children, their expectations, strong behaviours for learning, metacognition, all these different things, and making sure that our learners are supported in a remote setting as opposed to in class. We still need to explore the same sorts of things and have the same sorts of conversations. We know that metacognition is hugely important, for example, for learning. Well, that's true whether they're in the classroom with you or whether they are working from home. And so setting up those expectations, managing those expectations, working with these are all things that we're hearing from Scott and Matt, and are absolutely right and key to making all of these things work. But it's a really, if you started out in March, then that's a really difficult starting point to actually be moving through on these things. Normally, a digital strategy will take a long time to develop and build. Scott was alluding to it in his response, taking the time out beforehand, speaking to HODs, working out what was needed, choosing the platforms, all those different things. If you weren't in a position where like that in March, then it was really, really difficult for you to get traction, and many schools took time. There are plenty of resources out there. I mentioned the schooldigitalstrategy.com resource. There's plenty of resources and case studies available from government as well. There's lists of tools and products that can support education through sites like the EdTech Impact and so forth and so on. But my key advice really would be to really spend the time to engage with all your key stakeholders and map out a short-term strategy to get you coverage. Certainly we're in a position now where every school should be able to provide remote learning in a heartbeat, and that's a statutory requirement. But also sort of tying that into a longer term strategy, because you only got so much funding available. Starting your strategy with the idea that we've got X amount of money, so what can we then buy, is the wrong way to do it really. You should be thinking aspirationally about what you want to achieve with curriculum, teaching and learning, and then be thinking about how that technology can then facilitate that. And so it depends on your starting points really, to come back to the mainstay of the question, Will. If you're in a strong position like Scott and Matt are, then it's that part of the iterative process, reflecting on where you've been, measuring your success, and picking out the good things, and then refining that. If you weren't in the same sort of position as Scott and Matt, then it's the sort of firefighting, where are you at with that? And then what is our long-term vision for teaching, learning and curriculum in our schools, and how can technology then support that? But it's so difficult. I would not want to be a school leader at the moment, and kudos and hat tip to Scott and Matt for where they're at with their schools, because it was down. They mentioned the luck word, both of them, but
yeah,
I think it was an American basketball player. Maybe Magic Johnson, he said, that the more I practice, the luckier I get. And when you do plan and have these things on board, you make your own luck with these things. And so I don't think it was necessarily that Scott and Matt have got. It was a lot of hard work over a long period of time that just happened to fall into place just at the right time.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's hard, isn't it?
It's tough. And Mark, I think really interesting listening to your answer there, and it leads us really nicely actually into the next question, because you can do all of these things, you can have these strategies in place, or be building one as we speak, but the most important word here is always going to be impact. What impact is or has these strategies had, and how are you going to track and evidence that? Scott, do you want to start us off with that, the way you're going to track impact, or if you already have as well on parts of your strategy?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, a bit like having a digital strategy, having a school improvement kind of strategy, it ties into that, and we use a platform for that, a digital platform for our school improvement, CPD tracking, appraisal, all of that in one place, because it's an iterative process. Like Mark says, anything doesn't stop. Things like appraisal or CPD don't happen as one-off events. They're continually developing, and you're being reflective. So the impact will get picked up through our school improvement planning, because digital strategy and things are part of that. So things, just like we track whether it's pupil premium or looked after children or SEND, whatever it might be, this strategy, including things like independent study and things like that go along with it, will be tracked through the school system. So that's driven from sort of, from middle leaders and subjects back up into the school improvement plan. So if it's like developing an aspect of X, Y, or Z, staff will be, activities that are going on around the school will feed into that development strand, and we'll be able to track and see how that's going across the school, for whatever it might be. So if I am overseeing an aspect, I can see what maths, English, science are doing to support that strand, and that's very open, and everybody can see that, so staff can collaborate and work together to see best practice as well. And that obviously ties into our professional learning model on the Wednesday, because we can then be responsive if we need to there as well. So that's how we intend to track it, how we track everything else really. I
think it's what's really interesting there is having your staff be a part of that process, and it being transparent, and everyone being able to see the results. I think that's fascinating. And Matt, same question to you really. How are you and your school going to be tracking the impact of this strategy?
Yeah, so I think looking at a couple of the the low stakes testing websites that we've been using, such as it's very, very clear how we can track pupil performance over time, and where they're having their highs and lows, and what subjects and what parts of subjects they know very well, and what parts that they don't and they struggle with. where we can then sort of pour more intervention in. So that's been really, really helpful, that having that sort of clear, where you can see where the students' strengths and the students' weaknesses are. That's really good, because it helps us target the intervention, and it helps us work out then whether our sort of additional above and beyond sort of support that we're putting in for the pupils is working or not. It's early days, but it's, having technology that clearly sort of shows those sort of misconceptions or strengths is really, really useful, because you can then see whether things are having quite directly, whether they're having an impact or not. In addition to what Scott was saying as well, we're moving a lot of our teaching and learning and development of that side onto some more online platforms. We've just invested in a new product there last week to help with that. That's going to help really, really clearly with our visibility of teachers' strengths across the school, and also areas that we need to work on, so that we can then sort of team up with each other, sort of like small teaching communities to work on specific sort of areas of development. So that's really, really exciting. It's in its infancy at the moment, but it's an example of using technology in a way that can really move the school forward. I think, tracking and evidencing, and from a pupil's point of view via low stakes has been really, really important. And like we've also been using as well, like the likes of Google Classroom, throughout the pandemic as well, as a way for the pupils to check in. So so we've done some surveys, so we're tracking sort of the well-being side as well. So, doing specific surveys in relation to sort of anxiety levels across different areas. And that's been able to give us some data where we can then implement an intervention on a pastoral level, where students may be struggling when they're at home. And particularly if you've got students who are self-isolating, or a half a year group is isolating, or, you may have the whole school going off. We don't know what's going to come ahead of us. But it's really, really important that we use the technology that we've got as an open door, that students can still access us in a way to let us know, where they're struggling, not just academic. Also.
Absolutely, Matt. And it's fascinating that technology can kind of be that window, really, that you can use it for students to reach out to you, as they would have done in person, right, in the school. That's the whole point of those places. They're very safe. Mark, I mean, Matt kind of leads us really nicely into the question I'm going to ask you, and that is just looking or considering really the broader well-being of staff and students. If that's kind of a topic you'd like to explore a little bit.
Yeah, and what's been really nice, actually, and really interesting to see, has been lots of edtech developers over the last sort of 8 to 9 months have really started actually investing time in developing aspects of their products to incorporate wellbeing check-ins, reflections, all these sorts of things. So if we take Teams as an example, they've developed an app called Praise, which can be easily used to sort of recognize great sort of characteristics from our learners, not just from doing a good job, that sort of stuff, but showing when they've showed courage and leadership and all these different things. But they've also got things in there like the reflection app, which again gives the opportunity for you as teacher to ask questions about how they are and have those virtual check-ins and additional features like we're seeing coming across all the platforms with breakout rooms for students where they go off and do work in ways that they would normally better do it in the classroom. It's been, whilst the situation that we are in is absolutely terrible, out of adversity comes opportunity, I think. And I wouldn't wish the situation that we're in right now on the world at all. I would love to be able to go back 12 months and for things to be as they were then, but they aren't. But that said, given where we're at, I think the more we can do to be mindful and involve all our stakeholders and support them with the tools we've got available to them, manage expectations by being transparent and sharing things like when things are due and building in factors and times for that when you're delivering lessons, thinking about not just asynchronous but synchronous sessions as well, and what will actually happen during those synchronous sessions. Is it for live teaching? Is it the best use of your time? If it is, then that's great in your context, but many schools I'm working with are actually using the synchronous times for a guide by the side type opportunity. So rather than having direct instruction during the live lessons, they're receiving some support because some students would have completed tasks, let's say in Century or some other flipped learning activities. So when you do actually have some really quality time available to you with your learners, you're using that time to actually really drill down into the support that they need, but being mindful of all those things. Digital divide, when families will actually be able to access all the learning as well. You know, and we've got so many variety of different situations. We've got blended learning, where we've got some things happening online, some things happening in class, some things happening here and there. You've got hybrid learning. You've got opportunities where some students are at home while you're teaching in your class, and some students in your class. There are so many different things to take on board, and be mindful of. And it's being mindful of all of that, not just on the learners in your classroom, and making sure that you don't try, because best will in the world, you can't operate in the same way anymore as we used to, and that has an impact on the well-being and workload of both our learners and of our teachers as well.
Absolutely.
And so making sure that we build in the support structures to ensure that both of those two key stakeholders are able to continue and operate. You can't, you know, you can't, you can only give so much of yourself. You know, there's only so many hours in a day, and you know, you need to be really mindful of that when it comes to your learners and your staff as well. It's just so tough.
No, Mark, it is. I think something I picked up, I found really interesting what you were saying, is that it's a simple thing, but the world is not, the world has changed now. It is different. And to consider all these things, it's so vital and important to the functioning and success of schools around this country. And, you know, we've talked a lot about kind of edtech products and platforms and all of these different solutions. And it's wonderful that there's so much choice. Sometimes, though, there can be too much choice. You can be a bit lost when you're kind of deciding what to purchase. And so the final question, and we'll go through all three of you. We'll start with Scott. The final question is, what was your criteria for finding products, or has that changed? You know, as we keep saying, it's an iterative process. But yeah, your advice really to schools in your position looking to purchase edtech products.
Yeah, I guess the sort of the rule of thumb I've got has always been the same, but you might have let a few things slide a little bit here and there back in March. But I think at the moment, you know, we're trying to be a bit go back to normal and be a bit more stringent with what we're looking at. So things like, you know, what support is offered, what level of support is offered from that platform in terms of staff training, about onboarding, those kinds of things. What experience has real actual other schools got of that platform? Will that platform put you in touch with another school that's actually using it rather than just offering you a demo version online? That's something we've been burnt before on things like that, where they look great when you give it a demo, but the reality is not quite the same. So speaking to other schools, either locally or nationally, that you can speak to about how they've actually used it and what impact it's had on their students and staff. Cost obviously comes into it, and whether or not they'll give you, you know, longer term, shorter term deals, and how many students did it cost for, as a, for example, are you paying just for one key stage but everybody gets it, or those kind of things that are worth looking at and asking those kind of questions, and the ease of use and the setup, but then how much time and effort you're going to have to put in to keep it going. Does it look like something that you can already take skills that your staff and students have already got to sort of just get going with it, or is it something that's brand new that's going to need a lot of time and investment in terms of staff, students, because communication is a really important part of that, and if the platforms are offering support with communication, that's always helpful. And as Mark was saying, you know, in terms of well-being and stuff, what we found is communication has been the key in terms of well-being, making sure that everybody knows and everything's very honest and open, and this is what we're doing, and this is where we're going, and this is how you can get some support with that. So it's really important that the platforms are offering you some support with how to communicate to your stakeholders about that platform.
Scott, to push you a bit further on that, because I think it's fascinating talking about support. I think it might not have been something that someone would have considered perhaps when looking at various products. What's a good example of support that you're looking for, or that you have experienced?
I think it's like Mark said earlier about another question. It's about contextual support, not generic support. Generic support is good because it can get you, user guides and all those kind of things are great. But in the end, my maths teachers aren't the same as maths teachers. So they might need something very specific. So for example, the world has changed, and we are doing a webinar, and this is something completely new. The fact that people are sitting in front of a camera and having a chat is something that has unlocked professional learning areas that weren't there before. So we've got champions for Century, for example, in our core subjects, 2 staff who are the ones driving that through the school development digital strategy at their subject level. And they, in the summer with me, were working really hard to sort of onboard our students on Century and getting that going. But they then need to go one step further than that. They didn't need that initial. So Century provided some specific training on Wednesday afternoon during our professional learning via webinar to our staff who were champions. And then other staff have also had training that's bespoke to us, which is something I think has been a fantastic development from all the awful things that have happened.
No, absolutely. I think that's it really, isn't it? I think the bespoke level of the support given, that it's not generic, that it's not one size fits all. Thank you, Scott. And Matt, same question to you really, the criteria or advice you would give to people watching this about the various things they can purchase.
Yeah, I think Scott's taken all the good answers, but I'll definitely chip in with a couple more. I mean, trials are always good. I think that was one of the good things about Century during the lockdown. The fact that we had such a good amount of time to get used to the product and see if it worked. And I know you can't always get 3-month-long trials for something, but if you could, that would be a really good selling point. But I think the key thing for me is it linked to the curriculum? If it's an academic type product, is it really explicitly linked, whereby we can sort of align it quite easily, naturally, like Scott says, that they're easy to navigate. It's really, really important. That obviously what you see on a screen, like a laptop, can you replicate that? Is it on a tablet or on a phone, or does it lose its sort of scope a little bit? So I think that things are transferable across devices, because we did a survey with our kids, and it was 30% of them didn't have laptops, but 90% of them did have a phone that they could work on, and that's what they do work on. So it needs to be really important that it works on a phone. I think clear instructions for parents at home as well, and for staff, and like Scott says as well, like contextual sort of support, based on your own environment. Single sign-on is a really, really massive feature for us. Once you introduce another password into the equation, forget about it. That thing's not going to work.
Yeah.
My advice would be, make sure that you can have some sort of single sign-on that it hooks into your Google or your 365. Good support from the companies is a big plus, and effective reporting as well. But because you have to consider stakeholders, and so if you want to be reporting back to how effective something is, that you could then say that X percentage of them used it, X percentage of them increased in these areas, and these areas are key priorities, whatever it might be. So yeah, all of the above, and what Scott said.
No, Matt, thank you. That was a wonderful answer. What I'm really interested in is, you've talked a lot about in your answers today about getting parents on board and also training them essentially in how to use these products. Can you go into a bit more detail about that? How you approach that in the school?
So it's been really difficult, because obviously whenever lockdown happened, so one of the things we had to train obviously all our pupils in terms of how to use the likes of Google Classroom, or when we're at home trying to train them how to use Century. But actually accessing the pupils directly when they're at home is not possible. You have to go via the parents. Therefore, you're passing on a message to the parents that you want passed on to the child. That required a hell of a lot of phone calls. We did a lot of Screencastify videos. So we've invested in Screencastify, so whereby we'd actually just, you would see, and I would be talking over it, or a colleague of mine would be talking over specific instructions about, go to this website, click here, click there. And given parents like direct sort of like models of how to use the products that we're trying to promote. So it was really, really important that we were taking into consideration that parents are of all sorts of different abilities when it comes to technology. Some are absolutely really, really proficient, some less so. Some have several devices at home, are very comfortable with them, and some don't. So it's trying to sort of like differentiate like you would in a class, and making sure that you made available loads of different ways, whether it's a phone call, whether we did some Facebook Q&As as well, which were useful, which were, interesting, because if you put yourself quite out there whenever you put up on the the Facebook page that if you've got a problem with or a question, please ask me. And then you get 40 questions at once. You think, right, well, how do I respond to those live? But yeah, so I think like anything, just knowing that the parents know that you are aware that it's not easy, but that you're there to support, and that's been the main winner for ourselves, and being accessible, so that whenever they do struggle, that we get back to them. So it's the ways of doing it, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we were discussing a lot at Century during this time is that we never wanted parents or guardians to suddenly feel like they needed to become teachers. You know, they're there to support their children. They're not there to suddenly replace the learning that they were having, because that causes an awful lot of stress and anxiety. So it's really good to hear that that was a big part of your strategies to support those parents and guardians, to make them feel like they knew what they were doing and how best to help. And well, Mark, that question now to you, and you get the privilege of finishing us off today.
Thank you ever so much, Will. Yeah, I mean, to add really to what Scott and Matt have said, and you know, some fantastic responses there about how they're doing things in their respective schools. The best advice I can offer really is just to try not to do too much at the same time too quickly. You know, it's important to remember that these are change management processes, and under normal circumstances, you know, we would spend an awful long time bringing these things in, working with staff, working with teachers, with parents, working with children, you know, all those different things. Where we tend to see the most impact is where we don't try and do too many things at once. Recognize that implementation is best done through small steps, not trying to take huge giant leaps. So introducing 3 new things at the same time, which whilst on paper might be things you might need to explore, is unlikely to yield the sort of success that you're wanting to get. And so that's why a lot of schools have started with getting the foundations right. We heard both from Scott and Matt talking about how they spent time focusing on Office 365 or respectively Google Suite and Google Classroom. But getting that foundation in there and then supporting all the key stakeholders who are going to be using it to know how to best use it, and giving the wrapper of support and care. Things like Matt was saying about getting onto Facebook and being there to be able to support families and groups is super important. And taking a marginal gains kind of approach, making small tweaks, working on little things that you've mapped out that need to be sort of worked on, and skills that are required. Over time, those little micro wins, those regular Wednesday afternoon 2-hour sessions doing your CPD. Very at the beginning, you might feel like you've got a huge mountain to climb, but bit by bit, piece by piece, over time, you very quickly start to get mastery in all these different tools, and can add them in and do it that way. But yeah, my key bit of advice really would be just to add on to what Scott and Matt have said, is to not try and do too much too quickly. Don't try and implement too many things at the same time, and the involvement of all your stakeholders then is absolutely key. So consistent approaches work well as well. If you've got consistency, then there's that you avoid confusion. If you're thinking about how to provide equality of access, then think about how you can work in a synchronous and asynchronous way, so you're getting coverage for issues around things like digital divide, all these sorts of things. But the key salient piece of advice to say is just not to over egg it, and by that I mean just don't try and do too much too quickly too soon, and map out where you want to go, and think about those sort of stopping points along the journey, just like we might do in a car traveling from, let's say, Penzance to Scotland, John O'Groats. You know where your starting point is and you know where your end point is, but you're gonna have to have sort of some key milestones along the way where you might want to stop and fill the car up or whatever it is. The analogy rings true, and mapping those things out and knowing where you should be trying to get is really helpful. But the flip side to that is not beating yourself up if you don't meet those performance indicators as well, because there have been so many shifts and changes that are late sort of Friday night updates from the department and so forth and so on that always throw a spanner in the works. Stay true to your vision, true to your goals. Don't try and do too much too quickly, too soon, and involve all your key stakeholders would be my advice. And I'd say don't beat yourself up if things don't go quite right first time.
think you're absolutely spot on there, Mark. A lovely way to end this session. And on that note, thank you to Scott Nevitt, to Matt Worski and Mark Anderson. Thank you for your time today and your wonderful answers. And to Scott and Matt, I think your students are very lucky to have you both. And Mark, thank you so much for your wisdom as well. And you know so much about this area. So we're incredibly lucky to have you with us today.
Thank you.
And on that, yeah, well, thank you ever so much and have a lovely day, everyone.